Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today, in our Middle Ages unit, we are going to cover the Franks. The Franks were one of the Germanic tribes that were pushed into Roman lands that caused the fall of Rome, but they will become the most powerful of all those tribes and really establish themselves as quite a unique kingdom in Europe. We are going to look at the three C's today, three very famous rulers that come from the Franks that start with C. So we're going to talk about Clovis, Charles Martel, and this guy here, whose name is Charlemagne. So that is what we're going to cover. So our constructive response question covers that very nicely, so I'd like you to write this at the top of your page. The question says, distinguish the differences between Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, as well as some of their accomplishments. And we're going to cover that quite nicely here as we go through all three of those Frankish rulers. So Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, the three C's. So go ahead and fill that out at the top of your page if you're in my course. Now, if you look at this animated map here, what you were seeing here is the Kingdom of the Franks. So you can tell just by the growing expansion of the color blue that it gets to be quite big. So let's start here in 480. It's getting bigger and bigger. This is under Charles Martel. Eventually we get to Charlemagne here in around 800 AD. And Charlemagne's going to have the biggest territory, as you see there. And then it gets fractured into smaller groups. So bottom line is the Frankish kingdom is really the first kingdom after the Romans to really dominate Europe. So, Germanic kingdoms. We already know this, that in the upheaval between 400 and 600, small Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman provinces. We've talked about that a couple of different times. We talked about how the Vandals, Visigoths, Lombards, Britons, Saxons, and the Franks were pushed into Roman lands, and they start establishing themselves in new territories. What that also means is borders change constantly. What used to be the Roman Empire and its borders doesn't exist anymore. And as these smaller Germanic groups conquer each other and fight each other, these borders will constantly change. So you get a new culture as well. Remember, we talked about how these Germanic peoples couldn't read or write. So we get a very distinct change here. So family ties and personal loyalty were far more important to those Germanic peoples rather than having established public government and written law. So in a lot of sense, you had no government, like the Family Guy clip you see down here below. It was more, loyalty to your family, more taking care of each other that way than having somebody ruling over you with laws and government. So it's very, very different than what the Romans had. So, again, Germanic stress on personal ties made it impossible to establish orderly government. And I would expand on this saying, without their written language, because most of the Germanic peoples couldn't read or write, you couldn't write down laws. Therefore, you couldn't have established government. Well, in comes the Franks. So the Franks had power in Gaul. Gaul is modern-day France and Switzerland, and you can see that on the map here. So the Franks settled in right here, and you see Franks, France, there's a correlation there. So Clovis is going to be the first of the three C's that we're going to talk about here with the Franks. So here we see Clovis. Clovis was leader of the Franks. Now, as Clovis's power is going to grow, one thing we really have to remember is that Christianity is still there. Christianity developed under the Romans, not by the Romans, but at the time of the Romans. And of course it grew as different Roman emperors embraced it, like Constantine and Theodosius. But even after the Roman Empire fell, Christianity stuck around. So it was a constant in the Middle Ages. That means Clovis is going to come straight in contact with Christianity. So Clovis brings Christianity to the region. The way he does that is in a unique story. It's similar to Constantine's story, to be honest. So Clovis is fighting another Germanic tribe, and he as a Christian knows the power of prayer, so he fears defeat by this other Germanic tribe, and he appeals to the Christian God, basically prays and asks for victory. Well, the battle shifts in his favor, and the Franks win. So, of course, he's going to see that as a sign from God that he should be a Christian, his people should be Christian, and they should follow that faith. So what he does and how he brings Christianity to the region is he takes his 3,000 warriors, which is a small army, but a significant one at this time. So Clovis and his 3,000 warriors ask a bishop to baptize them, thus making them all Christian. Well, you also have to realize at the time that if these warriors are baptized, that means their wives are going to become Christian, their kids are going to become Christian. It's going to bring all of these people together under the banner of Christianity. So by 511 AD, Clovis had united the Franks in one kingdom. And a big part of that is making them all believe in the same thing, essentially by force. But if you have a belief system in common, that can unite you with a lot of different people. So Christianity brought the Franks together. Well, a Frankish empire evolves. This Frankish kingdom, again, you can see it here in yellow on the map, is going to only continue to grow and change. So the Franks now controlled the largest and strongest of Europe's kingdoms. Again, Europe was fractured into a lot of different groups after the fall of Rome, but the Franks are going to become the most powerful of it. So when Clovis died in 511, the Franks controlled most of modern-day France. Once we get through this story with Charles Martel and Charlemagne, you're going to see they're going to control a giant chunk of Europe and not just France. So this Frankish empire will certainly grow and evolve. Now, to build up this next part of the story with our next C, Charles Martel, I first have to tell you about an interesting position within the Frankish kingdom. So there was a Frankish position called Mayor of the Palace. Officially, as their official power, the mayor of the palace was in charge of the royal households and estates, kind of like a lord would be. But unofficially behind the scenes, the mayor of the palace could lead armies, could make policy and law, essentially ruling the kingdom. So the mayor of the palace was not the king of the Franks, but sort of became the most powerful position within the Frankish kingdom. And that's exactly where Charles Martel comes in. Now, Charles Martel has the coolest nickname ever. He's known as Charles the Hammer Martel. You can see that in the image on the left, and I just threw a picture, a little animated gif of Thor and his hammer on the right. So Charles the Hammer Martel. Well, Charles, by 719 AD, held more power than the Frankish king as mayor of the palace. Because he controlled a military, he had an army, he was a very powerful guy. Now, we also have to remember, because he's a member of the Franks, that automatically made Charles Christian. We had established that under Clovis, but Charles was part of the Franks and therefore was Christian. That's going to matter in the second part of this story here. So where Charles gets his fame, where Charles becomes really kind of a household name in the Middle Ages, is when he defeated the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours. Now, I had you label the Battle of Tours on your Islam map, and we did that on purpose because we wanted to establish this battle later on here in this unit. So Charles defeated the Umayyads, who were based in Spain, at the Battle of Tours in 732. Well, Tours is in France, and the Umayyads are Muslims. So the Muslims were moving from Spain into Europe. And so Charles meets them in France, and he wins. And what this does is it prevented further Islamic influence from spreading deeper into Europe. There's not a heavy Islamic influence in Europe today. Europe is very, very Christian. We could go through and find out which countries are Catholic and which ones are Protestant. We're not going to do that here, but Christianity still dominates Europe today. So as a result of winning this battle, Charles promoted himself as a Christian hero. Some people have even said that by stopping the Muslims from spreading, it's a turning point in history, because Islam could have invaded and taken more of Europe, and you might see more Islam in there today. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but Charles certainly felt he was a Christian hero by winning this battle. So after his death, his power passed to Pepin the Short. Pepin the Short was not necessarily short. It actually got his name from the length of his hair. He had shorter hair than the average leader at the time, and you didn't have barbers and hairstylists in the Middle Ages, so even men had longer hair. But Pepin didn't, so that's where he got his name from. And why Pepin matters in this story is, I'm not going to dwell on Pepin, he's not a big part of this, but Pepin, two reasons. First of all, Pepin is anointed by the Pope, which is basically like given this title, King by the grace of God. Now think about what that means. King by the grace of God. If you're looking at who's number one and who's number two in that title, it's clearly saying God is number one. Like, God gave you this power. God gave you this title. So by the Pope anointing Pepin, King by the grace of God, is sort of establishing that the church is the most powerful entity in Europe, not the Franks, not Pepin or any of these other leaders. So I tell you this part of the story just to establish this kind of power struggle between the church and potential kings in Europe. So the Pope anoints Pepin king by the grace of God, and this officially starts the Carolingian dynasty, the family that would rule the Franks from 751 to 987 AD. That's worth mentioning because that's the family that Charlemagne's going to be a part of, who I'm going to talk about next. So it's just sort of a side note, but it's an important side note. King by the grace of God, and also starting the Carolingian dynasty. So here's just a famous painting of the Battle of Tours. You see Charles in the middle there with his axe, waging war against the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours. All right, we're going to end part one there. When we come back in part two, we're going to talk about Charlemagne. He's the third C in this story and the most important and successful ruler of the Franks. So go ahead and hit stop and cue up part two.